Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Lasura, the Community Development Director for the city. And tonight you get to hear about all the things we're trying to do to better plan the city, Temple City. A little bit about what we've done in the past here. And you're going to hear a lot of concepts and information, but that's kind of what city planning is about, is bringing together a lot of information and issues in the city and determining the way the city should grow or develop and how you address those things as you go forward. I wanted to introduce my staff, my planning staff real quick, that's here tonight. You'll hear a little bit more about what we do for planning, but not a lot of the real nuts and bolts detail that on a day-to-day basis. You'll see there's another handout that you have that's called Planning 101. That's a little bit more about some of the day-to-day details of how we review plans and look at buildings and things like that. But tonight we want to talk a little bit more about our overall vision for the city and talk about how we want to get to a general plan update in the next year and how important that is for the city, because our existing general plan is a little bit outdated. So this is Andrew Korn, one of our interns, planning interns, who's helping set everything up. And in the back we have Adam Gulick, our associate planner, Hesty Liu, another associate planner, Jennifer Venters is our planning secretary, but she also helps with business license and building permits, and Sylvia Robles is our building permit technician, housing assistant, and Steve Pan is our building inspector, and then Giselle Corella is another one of our planning interns. And is there anyone else here? I think that's it. That's mostly our planning and building staff. So they may help with questions if you have burning questions, and also help facilitate talking about the plan and the exercise that we're going to do afterwards at the end, to let you guys actually go brainstorm and do some drawing on the map to see how some ideas on how you would like the city to look or plan the city. On that, I'll get started on our presentation. Now, who would like to say why we should plan the city? A couple ideas. Why should we plan our city?
So we can budget for potential improvement.
Okay, so understanding the costs of improvements in the city, infrastructure, etc. Any other ideas? Why would you want to plan your city?
Controlled density.
Controlled density, okay. A couple others?
Order.
Have order versus just chaos developing anywhere you want to develop, or build and not build some 10-story building when it may not fit with the neighborhood, right? Any others? Okay, those are the basic concepts. You want to be able to have the city themselves define the vision of what they want their community to be. So there's a process for that through planning that helps to facilitate that. You'll hear more about all of that throughout the presentation. Fostering economic stability is important because you don't want to just have a bunch of things built that doesn't produce any revenue. So you might need some things that produce revenue, like improves property values or sales tax, like certain kinds of businesses. And the way the economic and fiscal structures are within the state and local governments is that's how we get our revenues, is property taxes and sales taxes, and other special kinds of revenues, bonds, and things like grants, which you'll hear more about. Why we need to do some plans that helps us actually to be eligible for grants. Providing opportunity. Would you want to go to a city where there's not much to do there or no jobs? So you want to have opportunities for jobs and things like that. Manage growth. That's the order instead of chaos. You want to be able to manage your growth. Your population is going to grow. People have families and babies and build houses. If your population grows, you need a way to manage that and the impacts of that. More traffic, etc. Environmental impacts. The big part of planning is dealing with environmental impacts, which you'll hear more about. Address community needs and concerns. We've already kind of talked about that. But things change over time. So you need a way to address those over time and update your plans as needed to address various concerns, or you may do special plans, which you'll hear more about as well. Meeting regulatory mandates. Planning has a very complex technical and legal and regulatory framework that we as planners and city council members and planning commissioners have to deal with and understand what all those new mandates are. There's all kinds of state and federal requirements that we have to keep in tune with, and if sometimes we don't meet them, there's sanctions for things that can affect us, like certain kinds of funding, etc. Now, I introduced our staff, but to get a better idea of what we do, just to give you a quick overview, we want to be able to be part of the facilitation of these processes to guide the community's visions and needs, and be abreast of all those technical and legal requirements. But we also are there to implement the plans. They just don't get implemented by themselves. Sometimes you hear that people do all these grand plans and they sit up on a shelf, but we don't want that to happen. So we need to find ways to best implement the various plans and visions of the city. And we review development. So any new development that comes, planning has to review it that it meets the general plan and zoning requirements and any design guidelines that we might have. So there's a very extensive review process for that. Sometimes we call that entitlements or permit applications. So once it's approved by planning, it meets all the zoning. It could go to building for the actual construction and structural engineering and construction and building permits to actually do the building. And then we make sure that is built according to the plans that they submit. And last but not least, understanding the political and economic impacts, which we already touched on, but planning can be very political. People care about their neighborhoods. They don't want certain things. They may think growth is too much in a certain area, or a certain development doesn't quite meet either the intent or the specifics of the code. So we have a process for discretionary review and approval of certain kinds of development through the Planning Commission primarily. So there's a community and public input process that has a political aspect to it as well as an economic aspect to it. What's good for the city. And also, feel free to jump in and ask questions and make comments as we go along, because I want this to be more an interactive process if possible. If you have thoughts, the stuff on the screen you can read and it's the concepts, but if you guys have something you want to talk about, feel free anytime as I'm going along to do that. So, the beginning of the city, how is the city planned? Some of you may have already read our historical resources survey and may actually know a lot of this, because there's a very good timeline was in our recently completed draft historic resources survey about how the town of Temple started with Walter P. Temple. So he was the original visionary that created the original downtown for Temple City. And it wasn't until it was city yet, it was just a town, unincorporated county town. But he owned a lot of land. He had a lot of money from oil, etc., and family ties to land in the area, and he had a vision for a city of Temple City. But of course, part of his vision was economic. This was a way for him to subdivide the land and create a place where people could come and live, work, and play, but also create value. He wanted to make money, of course, so he wanted to create value. But he had a vision, and so part of that vision was the original downtown for Temple City. And it was based on, he had a vision of basing it on a variety of lot sizes, including larger lot sizes where people could actually have little mini gardens. We call them farmettes or ranchettes. And there's actually advertising that talked, that when he was advertising the town for people to come see it, to come and have your garden and be more self-sufficient. And I'm going to talk about that, how back then people were more self-sufficient, and you had a compact downtown. You didn't necessarily have to get in your car, and we've gotten away from that, and we may be trying to go back to that. And his vision was 1,000 businesses, 1,000 lots, accommodate 1,000 people, and again, he had the vision to create a compact city or town at that time that people would enjoy. And provide opportunity, all those things we mentioned, opportunity to live and work. And then part of his vision was to have a red car station in Temple City. So he convinced the Pacific Electric Railway Company to actually have a station in Temple City. And you'll see a map in a second, but so that was really pre-World War II. It was a compact grid system, short blocks, farmettes, and the red car, which is what helped the city develop at that time. And after World War II, the 50s on to the 80s, there was a lot more auto-oriented development and suburban sprawl. And we have some good timeline maps, which I'll show you, that'll explain that a little bit better. And today, again, as I mentioned, how do we kind of get back to the idea of a self-sustaining city that people can live, work, and play and not have to travel long distances. So here's that red car map. Some of you may have seen this, but it was a very extensive regional system that people were able to get around without the car. And you can see where Temple City is. Let me see. There it is. Temple City, the end of the red line was right there, and it ended in Temple City. So it was a destination at that time because the red car was the end of the line there. So you'll hear later on that do we want to try to create more of a destination city? And you hear city council saying all the time, we don't want to be a drive-through city, we want to be a drive-to city. So how do we do that? And you'll hear about that. Now, I mentioned to you that this is a graph of all the development in the city from prior to 1900 to today, of how many different development permits were issued essentially by each property in the city. And you can see that, not much early on in the late 18, early 1900s, but the town of Temple, this first period of development, town of Temple was started in 1924, and so you can see this jump up in development. And then you can see it goes up and down, up and down. So this is around 1933, so what would you think was causing this dip in development in 1933? Depression, right. So you can see that economics has a very big impact on how much development you see or how much growth you see in the city. So you can see that all the way throughout these ups and downs tend to be for things like economic recession when it slows down or other factors. And the factors that speeded it up. So right after the Depression, there was a big bump back up in growth because there was so much pent-up demand for growth, during the Depression. And then post-war, there was a big boom, as we know, that happened throughout the country. People coming back from the war, having babies. So we have this baby boom. We have easy financing through the VHA loan financing, etc. So you get this huge development going on. And so that's the biggest chunk of our development was at that time. And then in the 70s and 80s, it kind of levels off, and you see the cycles up and down. But we were already starting to get very built out, and we got some maps to show you that. Any questions or comments on that yet?
Did you just pick 20-year cycles? Is that?
Yeah, we just picked 20-year cycles because it's easier to just show that instead of 10 years, etc. And this map is actually based on those 20 years. So this colored map shows the 20 years, and you have it to refer to. But the dark blue is where the original town of Temple started. See a lot of the dark blue, and this area here was just an early subdivided area that crisscrossed Rosemead and Temple City Boulevard and Las Tunas. And the red car primarily was on Las Tunas, but I think it also extended up to Temple City Boulevard. And then the next growth, the largest growth, was, and Giselle, remind me, oh, here we go. I'm sorry. The blue, 245. And then the biggest growth, you can see it's light green, is the post-World War suburban development. You see the light green. So that's when the city really bloomed out and sprawled out from the less of the downtown oriented to just spread out. And then, I can't read it. And then the next 20-year period, you just see some commercial development. It's cetera. And I got some maps to explain this better as we go. So here's the original town site for the first 20-year first period, up to 45. So here's some little call-outs of the kinds of things that were happening at the time. The original town site. Baldwin here, you see some clusters of development where there's some older development, and Baldwin happened to be a major thoroughfare 10 Anita Park. So there was just some general development there, interest there. Any questions on that?
Going back to this other map, I'm looking at the orange on the previous map. And the Gateway Plaza, I guess the proposed, and it says 1967 to 1989. Would that be the second theater there, or would that be, the original was like the 1950s and 60s?
Oh, yeah, see, our permit data that we pulled this from only showed probably the more current Edwards Theater.
Okay.
Showing it around 1960, early 60s.
Okay, so it's not showing the original.
Yeah, I guess not.
Okay.
If we had had more time, those are the kinds of things we wanted to research more, but these are good. Part of this is to generate those thoughts like that as the city does go into its general plan update of some of that kind of history. But as you pointed out, this was, as I mentioned, the sprawl residential development. But in the early 60s on, we start seeing a little more auto thoroughfare oriented development on Rosemead with the new shopping center here, the theater, etc. And then some, it's larger subdivisions, more cul-de-sac oriented, more inward oriented kinds of development, more associated with more suburban sprawl development. And then we also had, industrial starting to develop more so in the southern end of the city.
So in that section from 23 to 45, where you have all the little white, those were all set up as lots at that time. They were just empty. Is that right?
Well, they weren't necessarily empty, but it could have been a farmland area or just something that didn't have a lot of development on it at that time.
So they were sold then?
Yeah, these parcels are our current parcels. They don't really show the history of the parcel changing. This is just our current parcel map showing the development over time. We didn't go back and get the historical maps. This is just kind of a timeline of development.
I see.
Yeah.
So it's just saying that, but if it says parcel and it's white, then we're all assuming there was no house on it.
Well, we're just piecing this out, showing one at a time, so you can just kind of better see what's happening at that time.
Okay.
And then the most current, you just see a lot of infill development where we still have a lot of large lots that could still accommodate one or two extra units, or some of the R2 areas where they can accommodate even more units, where they may only have one or two there now, they may be able to. So you see a lot of that. We see a lot of that on a yearly basis now. These lots converting to condominium projects, et cetera. But they tend to be very high-end, nice condominium projects, which adds the value to the city and adds the property tax base to the city as well. And then here you see Temple City Marketplace was developed a little bit later. The Chase Bank there is in white because it was developed prior to the 1989. Is that the cutoff there? But right around 1989 is when Temple City Marketplace got built, or basically they were starting construction around the time. And again, some additional industrial development down south. But this infill development is the older stuff that needs to be redeveloped, or it's older housing stock, older building stock that's ripe for, it just needs to be redeveloped. So, where do we go from here? If we need room for growth in your built-out city, what do you do? What do you have to take into account? As I mentioned, the older housing stock. We have a dichotomy of market demands. It's kind of the old versus new, where the new development or new generation might have a different idea of what should be here in the city versus, it's kind of the mom and pop small stores compared to the bigger stores or whatever it is. But there's also the cultural aspects of that, where we have a lot of new foreign investment where you get just a little bit of a different kind of a market demand versus maybe what the city's used to or what the city wants. So those things need to be taken into account. And our infrastructure system is aging, so it's getting more obsolete, and there's new things in regulations about stormwater runoff and how do we become more energy efficient, which you'll hear about, which we're trying to work on an energy efficiency plan. And our water infrastructure, which is provided by private companies in the city. How does the city control these private companies to make sure that infrastructure, water pipes are kept up to date? Because we hear about water main breaks all the time, and it's an issue we have to deal with. You know, and how do you deal with that without raising a bunch of taxes and rates and stuff in a fair way? You know, there's a cost to upgrading these things. Okay, so now what guides all this? And our overarching development document is our general plan. You hear about general plans and master plans. Does anybody know what a general plan is or has read a general plan? One and a half. All cities are required to have general plans by the state, and there's 7 mandatory elements of a general plan. I'm listing them here, and since these are the state required things, it's land use, where it's the map you see is where we're going to decide to put development. Housing is required, and housing element is required, and we actually have to accommodate all socioeconomic classes within our housing element to say how we'll provide opportunity for all levels of affordability for housing. And circulation is basically transportation, that you have a transportation system that meets your needs both locally and regionally. Now more and more there's regional requirements through SCAG and Metro and so forth, and new regulations which you'll see mentioned, but for example the new AB 32 and SB 375 requirements where SCAG has produced a sustainable community strategy for the region that tries to better integrate land use, housing, and transportation. And noise element is an environmental impact issue where you actually have to do noise contours of things that don't generate noise. They say like primarily traffic and streets, where the more traffic you get, the more noise it creates. And there's limits to what makes quality of life in a residential area, where you're not supposed to exceed a certain decibel level of noise. And these noise contours show that. So the more traffic you have, the more noise you have. So it's required to be in here. You know, the state determined that was one of the environmental issues that has to be in the general plan. But it's very affected by development and transportation. And you'll see there's lots of things going on with rubberized asphalt and electric cars that can help mitigate those things, but you can't tell everybody to have an electric car. Public safety is important. Just the health and safety of the community has to be addressed as you do your general plan. Conservation has to do with resource conservation. Natural resources. If every city in the state just built any way they wanted and they didn't look at how much resources they use, we may run out of gas and electricity and so forth. We wouldn't be able to accommodate it, but this is a way to show what your needs are for resources, and then regionally and the state looks at these things to determine that what the environmental impact could be of them. And open space is has to do with open space, landscaping, parks, and recreation areas. It's a required element. It's integrated very much so with land use, because you need to show that land use map too. But what's interesting about open space is the state requires you to have an element, but they don't tell you how much open space you should have. So it's really kind of up to the city to do what they want. There's some general standards, like you should have 4 acres of open space and parks per 1,000 people. In Temple City, we're very underparked. We're about less than an acre per 1,000 people, basically. So that's a big need here, but who is planning for that? The city needs to plan it for itself for those things, because the state doesn't dictate how much open space you need. So it's very important. Yes, Ken first.
On the noise thing, is it mainly cars, or does it include like air conditioning systems?
No, that's just cars. Circulation has to do with the...
Yeah, but I mean most of the mechanical equipment that you use for air conditioning makes noise.
Oh, for noise, yeah, that could be a factor. If you have big factories surrounding a residential area, it's going to make noise. And that shouldn't exceed a certain decibel level. Correct.
And do you have a projection of what the number of new people coming into Temple City will be over the next 20 years?
We knew you were going to ask that question. I don't have the exact number, but we've been growing about 4 to 5% every 10 years. Well, about 4% a year actually. And so SCAG looks at our history of our housing projections and gives us projections. We have those. But as you would guess, it's slowing down a little bit from what it's been in the past. And that's where, when we do a general plan update, we'll be looking very specifically at those technical projections and if they make sense for us, and what would we do about it.
Steve?
Yeah.
Ken is probably looking at average
sorry.
daily attendance for the school district, I would imagine, but the state requires you to have the general plan. Do they require you to update it in any period of time? And when was the last time we did have
Yeah.
a general plan update?
I was getting to that, but since you
Okay.
brought it up, 1987 was our last general plan update. So we're over about 25 years old. They like to see cities like to see cities update them every 10 to 20 years, depending on the growth of the city. You know, we're a little bit slower growth now, so 20 years would have been a good time frame, or we've exceeded that.
Okay.
In fact, you know, you could argue that 20 years, we should have done it sooner than 20 years, because, you know, from 87 to 2000, we might have had a lot more growth than we do now.
Gotcha.
But we're behind,
I see.
and you'll hear about that.
The housing element, there is a requirement. Isn't that like every 15 years?
Yeah, and the housing, we're getting to that too, but the housing element gets us a good reminder. Housing element, the state used to require that that be updated every 5 years, but now it's every 8 years, because they've gone to a little bit more of a regional system with SCAG and the SB 375, the Sustainable Community Strategy. They're trying to make those work together. The SCAG regional planning is every 8 years.
For us newbies, can you tell us what SCAG means?
Okay. The Southern California Association of Governments is our regional metropolitan planning organization that it basically is the whole Southern California region of 5 counties, except for San Diego. They have their own separate association of governments. So it's LA, Orange, Ventura, Imperial, Riverside, San Bernardino, I think. So it's 5 or 6.
Okay.
I don't know if it includes Imperial. But yeah, that's the whole SCAG region. Again, so housing elements, we're behind on actually updating our housing elements. Last updated in 2002, which I have a slide on, but I'll tell you about it now. 2002, we were due to update it within the last 4 years, but we were behind on that. We actually have a draft. We have a consultant where we're finalizing a draft now that's going to come to the Planning Commission, City Council. So the function of general plan, I think you already kind of have a good sense of that. It's the blueprint for the city, you know, in writing. It defines our goals and policies. It has a lot of goals and policies. So in essence, as the title says, it's more general. And in the past, they were more general. Nowadays, they tend to be a little, if we updated it, it can be more detailed with actual programs and things like that. Which we would try to go towards. And you'll hear, there's other plans we're doing, things like the bike master plan, which could have been part of our general plan, but we never did one. That was one of the goals back in 1970, do more bike planning. Well, it took 25 years, but we finally had a bike master plan that implements the general plan, but that will now be put back, when we do an update, the bike master plan will be part of that update more specifically. It might even be expanded on from our bike master plan to be integrated into the general plan. Environmental issues we talked about, development limits, the general plan, as you see on the map, that says you can't exceed certain floor area ratios or certain number of units on a property, so that sets the limit. Then general plan is very technical in terms of infrastructure needs and projecting out what our growth is and what our infrastructure needs are. So as you can imagine, being 25 years old, our infrastructure evaluation in that general plan is a little outdated.
Steve,
Yes.
on the general plan, is there a requirement that, once you get one current, that it will tie to the budget, city budget?
Part of when you do a general plan update, I guess we'll get to that in a little bit, but when you do the all existing conditions and so forth, and do a draft plan, normally cities, it's not required, but normally cities will do a fiscal evaluation of that general plan, of what the fiscal impacts would be of that development build out. So yes, that will be part of it. Again, it's short and long range, where the housing is the more short range, and long range is the overall plan. And there's a lot of state mandates and other regulatory requirements that are part of a general plan. And again, we've given you some additional handouts, and they talk a little bit more about general plans, but also, if you guys want it, we can email you some other references of other cities that have done recent updates. It has some good reference material on general plans, so we can email that to you as well, some links to those. Again, we went over this already, so I'll skip through that. And I mentioned the housing element update. The general plan would require us to basically go out for a request for proposals for consultants to help us, because the general plan process update comprehensively, especially since this outdated, can be a 2 to 3 year process, typically for most cities. To do it right, have full community vision input, which you hear, conducting visioning process, where you would actually typically have a general plan advisory committee of residents and businesses and organizations, in addition to commissioners, to sit down and vision and look at the existing conditions report here and start figuring out what the city wants. And then from that visioning, you develop alternative land use plans and growth plans to see what the city wants and what makes sense for the city, how much change or not change, and dealing with whatever infrastructure, et cetera. And this is just the process, general outline of the process, what we would be going through for a general plan update. Then as you select that preferred growth plan and start setting specific goals and policies, drafting the general plan, and then any plan of this size or large project requires an environmental impact report per state requirements, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, which you'll hear a lot of. It's called CEQA. So it's required to do an impact report, and that's where it will show a lot of the environmental impacts of the growth build-up of that plan that's chosen, and how you mitigate those impacts, whatever it is, the infrastructure you're going to need to mitigate, accommodate that growth, mitigate those impacts, and all kinds of conditions for mitigation that will be built into the plan. Yes, sir.
Why are you calling the general plan a project?
It's actually it's under California Environmental Quality Act. They define a project as anything. It specifically uses the words project for that's something that's subject to CEQA. And so if it's certain kinds of projects, some are exempt, but there's certain kinds of projects that's a discretionary approval that's subject to review of CEQA. Now, for a general plan, it's called a program EIR, not a project EIR, but it's a subtle difference, but CEQA defines everything as a project. But in this case, it's a program for a general plan. Does that make sense?
So
It's
why does
planning
it-
soup, I know. Planning
Why-
acronym soup.
Why does it need an EIR? That's my question.
Oh, why does it need it? Because the state requires any new projects in the city that could have a significant impact, they call it, requires an environmental impact report. And when you're planning a city to have all this new growth, you need to figure out a way to have a public process. CEQA requires a public review process to show what those impacts are and figure out how to mitigate them to less than significant impact. In CEQA, that's a whole other topic. CEQA, if you can't mitigate everything adequately, you can do things like a statement of overriding considerations, but all this is subject to legal review and legal challenge, things like that, but it's part of a public process.
Would the two items really be the sewer system and traffic? Are those the two major environmental impacts to the city? Or is there a...
Sewer, traffic, with the traffic is air quality issues, and water runoff. The more development you have more pollution that comes from the air and the development that goes onto the streets and that gets washed into the storm drains. So that you'll hear a little more about that, but there's very strict, water pollution requirements you got to follow, and they're getting stricter and stricter all the time. Sometimes you hear NPDES, National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. Does that answer your question? But it does look at every impact that could possibly happen, essentially. You're required to look at just about everything. Yes?
You mentioned that the housing element needs to be updated every 8 years.
Yes, correct.
And it says here was last adopted in 2003.
Yes.
We're
We're behind.
behind. Are there any ramifications?
There could be, because you're supposed to be addressing affordable housing, showing where there's opportunities for people who can build affordable housing. You don't have to actually construct it, you have to be able to accommodate affordable housing for all levels of income. And they actually do a regional housing needs assessment and allocation process for every city. And they tell us, through SCAG in the state, they tell the city, here, you need to build, for us, I think it's 900 units overall from this last round, but that's split up into above moderate, low income and very low income. And they base those numbers on the overall growth of the city and how much you've already developed in those areas. And so it comes out pretty even for us, that, you know, about roughly 25% of each of those that we're supposed to provide. And we're behind in it. But so if you don't do that, you may not be eligible to get grants if you're applying for grants to provide affordable housing or whatever it is. And there's some other legal things that can happen where they can actually force you to approve projects, for example, without even approving them because you don't have an adequate housing element. So there's implications. Any other questions on this? Now, when you talk about, besides our general plan, that's our local plan, but there's also other things that guide our development as part of like a subset of our general, like the downtown specific plan, which actually, by the way, I've got some plans floating around. If you want to pass them around, that's the downtown specific plan. One of the general plans. There's a bike plan and our draft traffic calming plan, which is just an administrative draft. Staff is still reviewing it actually. And then there was one other one. Which one was it? I thought there was one other plan. Anyway, they're floating around. If you guys want to pass them, the historic resources survey.
Right.
Pass them around to look at. Most of those are online if you want to download them, but if you guys specifically want a copy, let us email us. We can get those to you. But the zoning is part of our municipal code that actually has the actual development standards that are consistent with the general plan, but it's more specific about how much parking you can have, et cetera, things like that is our zoning code. The staff uses on a very daily basis for development reviews. And then the city's not an island, and we need to be part of a whole region and our adjacent cities. And I mentioned SCAG and the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the local sub-regional COG, Sangamon Valley Council of Governments, and then there's other bigger regulatory agencies like AQMD, Air Quality Management District, and the Water Board, Regional Water Quality Control Board, that all have their own regional plans that are supposed to be incorporating our general plan, as well as, we work with them on a regional basis and sub-regional basis to make sure we're all integrated in meeting their guidelines. SCAG, for example, is regulated by federal requirements for air quality. It's one of their big things, and transportation has a lot of air quality impacts. So, the federal government says you got to reduce smog and et cetera. You got to meet certain levels of attainment, and so they, through their transportation and housing and employment planning, are trying to balance those to have better development with less impact. That's why they're advocates of rail transportation and public transportation to get people out of their cars. The state, as we mentioned, has affordable housing requirements for the housing element as an example, and CEQA we mentioned, so I've already mentioned all these things. But if you have questions on these, let me know. And the stormwater is a federal regulation as well. Any questions on that?
Just on the metro system, is there ever a plan to have a central metro stop like El Monte has, where you can drive and park and get on a...
Or here?
Yeah, some regional area or closer than El Monte?
El Monte's pretty close to us, but we are always trying, I think you'll hear, we're going to try to advocate for more transit options, which means you should try to expand bus routes and capabilities. Our bike master plan is another way to try to accommodate more mobility and transit options, alternative, use to the vehicles.
I think technically we have one in Temple City, that's the Chamber of Commerce parking lot.
Is it?
because some federal funds were used to put that up as a park and ride.
Oh,
So anybody.
so use it to park and ride at the Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
Good. People should know that.
Can you go to Rosemead and get the bus?
I think so.
Yeah, to the bus stop right
Yeah.
in the corner.
So, planning is how do we meet challenges, and, we want to be proactive. So we can't live by the general plan alone, which I alluded to, that we also need to address needs as they come along. I mentioned the bike master plan, but implementing the general plan goals, it just doesn't implement by itself. You may need some additional plans, like you mentioned, the downtown specific plan, and the new laws, and all these things are going to be important updates to or important input to our general plan update, as you'll see. For example, we designed, or we planned all these great new improvements for Rosemead Boulevard to address safety and beautification, but also some environmental issues with new bus stops and new pedestrian sidewalks, where there's not even sidewalks, to get people out of their cars and want to walk. And for example, in Rosemead Boulevard, we've included some drought-tolerant landscaping and areas for water to run off and permeate into the ground versus just going into the storm drain. So those are examples of how we're trying to meet some of those kinds of issues that you've seen in the general plan, but we did it as a part of an overall improvement plan for Rosemead Boulevard. And then some ones that we're currently, I mentioned bike master plan again, but currently working on downtown parking plan and traffic calming master plan. The downtown parking plan is addressing a need. We've got new development, new businesses that need a lot of parking. And so the businesses are concerned that there's not enough parking. And the city kind of developed around this downtown and made the decision in the past to have public parking instead of on-site parking for every business. So that public parking needs to grow and accommodate the needs for those businesses. So that's what our downtown parking plan is trying to address, how to accommodate the needs now and some future growth. So we're trying to schedule a study session. We've got some initial recommendations for that on how we maybe do better parking management. It might be things like parking meters, but it might also be adding more parking supply through parking structures, et cetera. And how do you do that? And what are the real needs? So you'll hear more about that. And the city would like to, it has a sort of a informal street tree plan right now, but something we might consider formalizing more. Since there are so many beautiful trees in the city, and it's a big part of this city. Continuing on, other kinds of plans, action plans we call them, or just more specialized plans. The energy efficiency I mentioned. We just had an energy efficiency fair last week on Wednesday before the summer concert. We were actually trying to get input and feedback as part of that plan. The Edison and the Southern California Council of Government, or San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, is actually sponsoring that. So they're actually helping pay for the work for that for us. They've got consultants. So we're actually getting that on the cheap. It's just some minor staff costs. Even they're reimbursing us some of our staff costs, but just minor incidental costs. So we're going to have in the next few months at least the beginning of energy efficiency plan as part of it. That will feed into our general plan update is an important component of that.
Quick question, what is significant, if any, to the hand in this art?
Oh, this is just an example of art that was being considered. This is actually multifunctional art. These are actually bicycle racks.